My name's Keith Hopper. I provide strategy coaching for teams and products. I want to start with a story. So a little while ago, I was leading product at an organization that had embraced Agile. And I was in a meeting with a senior executive and an Agile product team. And the senior executive was declaring a big new product direction for the company. And somebody on the team, I think it was a junior engineer, sort of raised their hand and said, how do we know this idea is any good? Which I think set back the executive a little bit and probably thought the question was impertinent. But I'll argue it didn't come from a place of impertinence. It came from a cultural norm that had emerged on the Agile team over the year or two that they had been practicing. And that norm was identifying assumptions and challenging them amongst each other. And I think this is an example of where a cultural change is emerging from the bottom of the organization, and it's challenging the way that organizations set and communicate strategy. So I'm going to try to dig into that. So first off, Agile has become the norm for how products are developed. And by Agile, I don't necessarily mean a very specific methodology. I mean small, fast-moving teams that exhibit sort of three behaviors in order to be successful. The first is continuous reprioritization. The second is designing and running experiments and gathering evidence. And the third is orienting the teams around users and customers as the center of their process. And the organizations that, the teams that follow these processes can successfully develop products, in my argument. Something really interesting about these three behaviors, though. The first is that they're pretty radical changes from how teams have done product development in the past. So that change in behavior trickles down into a change of thinking and a change of culture that emerges in these teams. And second is all three of these behaviors orient around how teams make decisions and set direction. And for that reason, or for both those reasons really, they challenge the way that organizations have traditionally set direction and made decisions. I think this is best characterized as a shift in a centralized planning mindset versus a test and learn mindset. And the easiest way to do this is to have my slide not build, but I'll just describe it. So a team on a blue line, a sort of a traditional team, would for a product launch, would identify all the features required for launch. They would develop a big upfront plan for just those features, a very robust, formal plan, and they begin working against that plan. And as they first started working, they would work on probably the most valuable items on the plan. And then farther along the plan, maybe a little less certainty, maybe more bells and whistles, and so the value would taper off, which I think we can understand intuitively. The red line represents an Agile team who works at the beginning in the same way. They're identifying the most valuable stuff to work on, but at that first dotted line, they're going to pause, and they're going to put what they've done in front of customers. We're probably familiar with this, many of us. And what happens, of course, is the customers say, you mostly got that right, but here's some stuff you didn't get right. And yes, that's important to us, but the way you implemented it isn't quite right. And oh, that thing you have way out there, we actually want that tomorrow. So this sort of feedback allows a team to sort of do what they did at the beginning of the process. They reprioritize, and they're able to identify the most valuable items next. And so they can deliver more value in that next cycle, and then lather, rinse, repeat. You've got teams that can deliver significantly more value in the same amount of time using Agile than they would if they just stuck with a formal plan. As teams work on this is not easy, by the way. The teams that have figured it out tend to get addicted to this process for somewhat obvious reasons. They can deliver a lot of value, but it's also significantly more flexible and much more responsive to customers. But one interesting externality happens when they become addicted to this process, and that's sort of a slow building resistance to requests for formal plans or long-term commitments. So this is kind of characterized somewhat stereotypically in an Agile team being asked to produce a long-term feature roadmap, and sort of the eyes roll. We don't do it that way. So what I wanted to do was so that's the basis, right? There are two modes of thinking that have shifted, but I want to give some specific examples or some specific scenarios that I think sort of highlight this cultural challenge. So the first is, I mentioned that teams are putting these ideas out in front of customers, and one of the first things that happen when you put a new idea out in front of customers is customers do not use the product at all how you assumed they were going to use it. And if you've ever participated in a user test, this is sort of an obvious fact. We all sort of the shock and horror of somebody using products in some weird way. However, if you begin doing what you saw in the previous diagram and you're doing releases continually over time, it stops becoming surprising. And so what teams initially thought where they were sure that they were right they start to assume that they're not. So that's exactly what happened with this junior engineer, right? They heard from an executive what they thought was probably a pretty good product idea, but they've also had the experience that pretty good product ideas frequently surprise them in that they weren't always quite what they thought. So that, again, raises this idea of a tension and a culture clash between sort of decisions and direction, and then a built-in skepticism around that amongst teams who have actually practiced it. The next scenario is, imagine in a traditional environment, you're making a product decision, you're gonna go seek out the people in the organization who have the unique expertise, the knowledge of the market, the understanding of the direction of the business to make those decisions. So you're looking up in the organization to get those answers. Well, Agile teams tend to work pretty differently, where on a day-to-day basis, they're touching customers constantly, they're collecting knowledge, they're doing this test and learn work, and that's helping them amass a bunch of local knowledge in which to make decisions, so that when big decisions come along, it seems natural and obvious to them that they're gonna do it based on the knowledge that they've collected, they're gonna do it based on the interactions with customers. And while this characterizes a shift in where decisions essentially get made, I think more importantly, it characterizes a perception of where in the organization the knowledge lives. And that's a pretty big change. And finally, teams who are sort of working this way, they're moving super quickly, they're doing lots of releases in front of customers. Along the way, you're not gonna stop and wait for permission to sort of, we've got a release, tonight. I gotta go find somebody to seek permission from. Doesn't really work. Also, they're not gonna sit around and wait for direction in order to make some of these decisions. So over time, teams tend to build up a significant amount of self-direction and autonomy. And as we can imagine when we were teenagers, when we first got that self-direction, or maybe younger, as this picture suggests, when we got farther along and sort of got that autonomy for the first time, it's sort of very difficult to sort of turn back from that, right? Even when maybe we should, right? Even when the teams maybe should be taking direction from elsewhere. So I've tried to make this argument that there's a whole bunch of behavior that's new and it's happening sort of at the bottom of an organization and coming up, and that behavior is resulting in a cultural change that creates some tension between how organizations have traditionally set direction and made decisions. But I don't want to suggest that this means there's no place for strategy, regardless of the name of my talk. I think that we can all intuitively understand when you look at an organization that has distributed teams all over the place, and each which might be highly effective in generating lots of revenue for the company, but still maybe a huge missed opportunity when you look amongst that space and see each team chasing separate objectives. What a great opportunity it would be to sort of collectively direct them towards organizational objectives. So it'd be that'd be a whiff if you couldn't do that. So my question isn't whether or not organizational strategy should exist. My question is how it should exist. So if this is true, if cultures are changing and the way that these successful teams are operating is changing, how does one align these teams? How do you inspire organizations and teams that are operating quite differently in this environment where you can't just sort of dictate a direction for the company in maybe a more traditional way? And when, under what circumstances does it make the most sense to do that? I can imagine, for example, different business conditions in which you want to invest resources in a particular team over another team, or business conditions in the environment that really start to suggest that. So those are the sort of things I want to discuss in the breakout. And in parting, I want to suggest that the people in an organization who are currently responsible for doing corporate planning and strategy are highly focused on what's happening outside the company. The external forces are crazy, right? They're really changing the way that strategy is developed. Everything's moving quicker, competition, obviously the speed of digital. And it's smart to do that. But I think it's smarter to also look inside the company and the changes that are happening there. I think the organizations that can understand how to align with and inspire Agile teams towards common and shared direction for an organization are ultimately the ones that are going to win. Thank you.